In recent decades, it has been normal to consider the tenant of the White House, the President of the United States, as the most powerful person in the world. However, dear viewer, things, they might be changing, or maybe they've actually already changed. Have you heard about the Chinese president? Well, of course you have, because I'm sure you're a very avid VisualPolitik viewer. Now, you see, Donald Trump himself, in statements collected by the Washington Post, described the Chinese president Xi Jinping as the most powerful leader that China has had in the last century, which is as good as saying that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader of all time. So much so that more and more analysts are wondering if he isn't, in fact, the most powerful political leader in the world. Yes, it's true. Now, while China's economy and its army are still on a second level compared to the United States, Trump seems to consistently be losing his influence over the world and indeed his own country. And when you go over to China, you can see that the situation is pretty much the opposite. But wait. Trump is losing his influence in the US? I mean, how could this possibly be the case? He wants to be everyone's friends. Haven't you seen his rather sweet tweets lately?
Why would Kim Jong-un insult me by calling me old, when I would never call him short and fat? Oh well, I try so hard to be his friend, and maybe someday that will happen.
Yes, it's definitely no surprise that the United States is losing its influence over the world. In just a few months, Trump has gone from nuclear war to schoolyard fights. Alright, anyway, back to the serious stuff. The fact is that although Xi Jinping isn't the president of the world's leading power, he does control China's leadership tightly, a country which is one of the most important economic engines on the planet. And of course, for Beijing, Trump has been something like the lottery jackpot. Protectionism, nationalism, and Donald Trump's mistakes have allowed Xi Jinping, the president of the world's largest dictatorship, to present his candidacy as a sort of global political leader. In January 2017 at the Davos Forum, Xi Jinping promised that China would become nothing less than the champion of globalization, of free trade, and even the fight against climate change. Thus, Beijing aspires to put its grasp on the terrain that has been lost by Washington. He only forgot to mention, well, you know, freedom and all those other sorts of apparently unimportant things.
经济全球化曾经被人们视为阿里巴巴的山洞，现在又被不少人看作潘多拉的盒子。
But now, what happened in the last Chinese Communist Party Congress? How much power does Xi Jinping have and what does he want? Well, we're going to discuss all of this. But first, let's take a look at China today.
The new China.
Do you think that China is still a country where people live in deplorable conditions, breaking their backs for miserable wages? Well, I'm sorry, but the reality is you're actually pretty wrong if you think that. 2018 will be the 40th anniversary of China's reform and open policy. And this country, it's changed a lot in that time. China is no longer a low-income country, but indeed a middle-income country. In fact, taking price differences into account, it would have purchasing power parity of about $16,000, which is bigger than both Colombia and Brazil. Also, its economy has changed, and nowadays services are the most important activity. For example, in electronic commerce, a sector in which the country is beating Europe and even the United States, China represents no less than 40% of all global transactions. The same can be said of mobile payments, which are so popular in this country that its market reached $5.5 trillion in 2016, which is 50 times more than the United States. All of this could be described as not bad. I mean, their growth has been so large that just in the last 6 years, China's private consumption has grown by $2.5 trillion, an amount that equals India's entire GDP. Therefore, when you visit one of those giant Chinese cities, it's not at all uncommon to find a city full of skyscrapers, billionaires, and high-speed trains. But hold on just a second here, because China's poverty continues, and in general, there is a really large difference between the country's cities and the country's rural areas, which remain poor. Very poor. In fact, they're so poor that 43 million people, almost the entire population of Spain, by the way, still live in extreme poverty, earning less than $1 a day. And not only that, almost 40% of Chinese people still live at fairly low economic levels, although the situation is much better than a few decades ago. This is all true, but as I said before, they're changing very quickly, and we can no longer think of China as we did 20, 10, or even just 5 years ago. By the way, talking about poverty, here's an interesting fact. Do you know how the Chinese government fights against poverty? Well, one of its main strategies is actually creating new businesses and cooperatives in the poorest of communities. To this end, the government has granted almost $400 billion in small loans to help launch several companies. And they not only focus on money, but also on culture.
The evening news is filled with tales of rejuvenated communities and villagers turned entrepreneurs heaping praise on Mr. Xi and the government for providing loans and new apartments. Javier C. Hernandez, China correspondent for the New York Times.
Yes, I know. Xi Jinping and practically every country leader talk a lot about Chinese-style socialism. The truth is that this is just a reference to a kind of capitalist model locked up within a dictatorship. China isn't an ideological dictatorship, nor a socialist or communist one. It's just simply a dictatorship. Having said that, now let's talk a little bit about Xi Jinping, the person leading this new China with almost total power.
Xi Jinping, the leader.
Born in 1953, we could say that Xi Jinping is a pretty interesting dude. On the one hand, he's probably the Chinese leader who's had the most contact with the West. His daughter studied at Harvard, his sister even lives in Canada, and he has visited the United States several times. In fact, in 2012, when he visited the United States as Vice President of China, he made a somewhat peculiar stop. He went to Iowa. Well, at this point, you're probably wondering, well, why did he go to Iowa? Well, the fact is that in 1985, when Xi Jinping was a young party county secretary in China, he traveled to Iowa to investigate agriculture-related issues. So in 2002, he went to see the family that he'd stayed with at the time, and he brought them presents. Pretty cool, right? In addition, President Xi's Yankee side, it doesn't end there. He's also known to love Hollywood movies. But there is also another side to this. Since he became China's highest authority 5 years ago, his government has been characterized for having the most censorship and repression for a very long time. We only need to take a look at the latest cybersecurity law, which seeks to control even more of the internet in China by restricting anonymity. Indeed, this is to such an extent that all social network accounts have to be backed by an identified citizen. Further, it's been decades since China saw such a strong leader. We could say that all this propaganda has worked greatly, but that's not really surprising now, is it? The fact is that in these 5 years, Xi Jinping has made several changes in China, starting with the army reform and their very active foreign policy. We saw it here at VisualPolitik how Xi Jinping has diverted national resources towards foreign policy. A good example is this new Silk Road macro project, which aims to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in several countries. But generally, their greatest commitment has definitely been the fight against corruption. And this is seriously important. Since Xi Jinping came to power, over 1.5 million members of the Communist Party have been sanctioned and nearly 300,000 have been prosecuted, including 43 members of the Central Committee. And there's more. Within the framework of this fight against corruption, 13,000 army officers have been dismissed and more than 50 generals have been imprisoned. Of course, as you might expect, not everyone sees this battle as clean and honest.
It's a selective anti-corruption campaign. Its nature is the selective protection of corruption. When you purge some corrupt officials, you are protecting the others. You protect the corrupt system, and you protect corrupt people who support you. Bao Tong, Chinese activist.
Yes, Xi Jinping has mostly relieved his political rivals. Coincidence? Of course, it's very clear that Xi Jinping has gained a lot of power in these 5 years. This was certainly observed in the last Chinese Communist Party Congress, the most important political event in the country, which is held every 5 years.
The 19th Congress.
The 19th Chinese Communist Party Congress, held between October the 18th and 24th, 2017, was quite peculiar, especially because it may have been the most austere Congress that the Chinese Communist Party has celebrated in many, many years. On this occasion, some amenities, they were removed. How about some examples? Well, among other things, there was no lavish buffet, there was no hairdressing, there were no facials and tailoring services. I mean, all of these used to be offered for free to participants, and it had almost become a tradition. But above all, this was the Congress at which Xi Jinping's adoration reached its highest point, something that, as you can imagine in China, means being put on an almost Mao-like level.
5 years ago, I said he would be China's most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping. I was wrong. He is now China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister.
See, this Congress led to the decision that the so-called Xi Jinping thought should be included in the Communist Party constitution. This may seem a bit strange, but it actually means that Xi Jinping is no longer just another leader, he is in fact the leader whose words form the party's own ideology.
It means Xi is essentially unassailable. If you challenge Xi, you are challenging the party, and you would never want to be against the party. Bill Bishop, publisher of the Sinocism newsletter.
So far, only Mao Zedong has received such an honor in life. But that's not all. Currently, a president's mandate is limited to 10 years, which means that this would be Xi Jinping's last term. But do wait a minute here, because no successor was considered during the Congress, which leads us to believe that Xi Jinping may be at least aspiring to a third term.
Chinese universities scramble to open centers to study President Xi Jinping thought.
But anyway, beyond the Chinese border, this Congress helped define 3 major priorities for the Chinese government in upcoming years. First, there's the economy, which means fighting poverty and opening up more to the world. Second, there's the idea of launching even stronger foreign policies. And third, start worrying about the environment. And, even though I said there were 3 priorities, there is kind of a fourth, and it's actually a pretty clear one, and that's consolidate the Communist Party's power. And this is because we know 2 things for sure. On the one hand, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party will stay for a long time, and on the other hand, China will reclaim its role as a superpower. So the reality is, we're going to have to get used to taking Beijing into account. And now it's your turn. We've got an important question. Who do you think will leave power first? Will it be Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin? Well, you can leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed this video, and please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.